So I had planned on making a video about Mandalorian Season 3 before it officially launched on Disney+, but thanks to Quantumania and The Last of Us filling up my notepad for the past few days, I decided it was better to wait until the first episode of the new season aired before diving into the specifics of my feelings on the show. There are a lot of Star Wars fans here in this community, and I knew it was important to make a video that highlighted why this season, almost more than any other, is so important to the longevity of The Mandalorian as a character on the big screen. So that's what I'm going to be discussing today. Why The Mandalorian needs to evolve and how it can set itself up for future seasons moving forward.
A clan of two.
Since the start, The Mandalorian has been a fun and investment-light way of exploring the farther reaches of the Star Wars canon. It doesn't rely heavily on an intense story or uniquely specific writing styles to find its audience, which might be the biggest reason as to why it's become so adored by nearly everyone who's watched it. Sure, Baby Yoda is kind of what drives the ship nowadays, and that has its own drawbacks, but more often than not, The Mandalorian has become a show for everyone in the fandom, and it's always delivered a steady dose of digestible but entertaining content for an IP that really needs that consistency. While the action has always been engaging and even gotten better with later episodes, the one blemish that I think a lot of people are starting to take note of is the lack of meaningful substance in Din Djarin's story. It's been 2 full seasons up until this point, and the only thing we really know about him is that his family was killed during a separatist attack, and he has an undying loyalty to the traditional practices of the Mandalorian lifestyle. While both these anecdotes serve their purposes to an extent, I think the absence of depth for Mando is likely due to not just the standard serialized nature of the show, but an over-reliance on Grogu as the focal point of seasons 1 and 2. Since the very first episode of season 1, we've been accustomed to an experience that centers around escorting Grogu to and from different places, and at the time, it was fun to be on that journey because everything was so new. The characters were all being introduced and the stakes weren't immediately known, which made it pretty easy to turn your brain off and enjoy the ride. And while that ride is still enjoyable, inevitably, Mando has started to feel sidelined against his own development, and that really creates a predictable feedback loop that's tough to address openly. I think season 2 tried to remedy this by introducing more Mandalorianisms to Mandalorian itself, even going so far as to remove Grogu from the story in the end, and these are some decisions I was fully on board with. Up until this point, the show managed to avoid exploring the extensive history of Mandalorian subsects, whilst still giving just enough of Din Djarin's backstory to satisfy the short-term questions, but it's clear that the desire for more was hanging over the head of season 2, and that's when we got one of the best decisions I think the series has ever made: removing Grogu altogether. This was, however, short-lived thanks to an unbelievably frustrating retcon in Boba Fett, but we'll get to that in a minute. You see, the original gamble of taking Grogu away had much more of an impact than just shaking up the theme of this space western. It forced The Mandalorian into a narrative corner and tasked the writers to evolve Din Djarin in a more fundamentally interesting way. I wish this was a decision that lasted through the entirety of season 3 because it would have introduced a level of stakes for both Din's development as well as the story of breaking away from new and older Mandalorian traditions. We never got a lot of one-on-one time to spend with Mando, and for a series that marketed itself around this bounty hunter, it often feels like the side characters of this world have always been a few shades more complex than the main protagonist. This doesn't mean Mando has turned in a bad performance, but more so that there's a level of insight and dimensionality to the character that tends to be missing, and it can't be explored as creatively when he's busy escorting Grogu or shooting nameless enemies. Again, most if not all elements of the first 2 seasons have played out in an interesting way and have been enjoyable enough to keep me invested, but I do wish we got a bit more to chew on with Din Djarin as the center of attention. This brings us to what I think is not only the true start of season 3, but also 2 of the best Mandalorian episodes to date: the double feature during the Book of Boba Fett. This was the first time post-rescue that we got a sense of Mando as his own character since the beginning of season 1, and it was that exact style of freedom that I think works really well for this type of protagonist. Instead of being tied down to protecting Grogu or dealing solely with remaining Mandalorians in the Watch, Mando had a blank canvas and a wider sandbox to play in that enhanced the investment in following his story. From the Glavis Ringworld and Underbelly combat trials to upgrading his ship back on Tatooine, there was a lot of environmental creativity thrown Mando's way, which gave us more time to evolve his personality from the original timid yet expertly trained Mandalorian. This series kind of went back to its marketed roots, with Mando taking a few bounty jobs and embodying the Lone Ranger lifestyle that made his debut such a fresh addition to the Star Wars slate. I think Mando works best when his bounty hunting and exploration get the time they need to shine, specifically when it's away from the continuous escort missions of his first 2 seasons. In hindsight, I think it's much easier to look at the return of Mandalorian in the Book of Boba Fett as the official start of Mandalorian Season 3, because after watching the newest episode, it came across more like mid-season filler than the pilot for his big return. It's not that this episode was bad, because I don't think it was, but it wasn't as gripping of an opening as maybe it needed to be to welcome everyone back into a new season, especially one that's boasting to be the biggest yet. There was a bit of downtime that felt more or less like there wasn't much for Mando to do, which made for a few rushed scenes in the mix just to keep something on screen. This is an issue that's existed since back in Season 1, and granted, it could be a creative choice. To be fair, Season 2 of The Mandalorian started somewhat similar and became a project that was greater than the sum of his parts, which makes me think Season 3 will follow in those footsteps. But it does bring me back to this idea of substance and making a lot of these shorter runtimes really count. By now, we're 3 seasons into a world that's pretty well established, and it feels like we're still waiting for that bigger hook to reel us in, outside of just familiar faces and places. The highlights of this pilot were where I think the season really needs to go, when it focuses the lens around Mando's journey and dove headfirst back into the lore around him. We visited the old Mandalorian castle on Kalevala, but just as it started to dive into more of that world and those interesting relationships, it was time to wait for next week's chapter. This season has more weight on its shoulders to evolve the Mandalorian product, maybe more than any other installment before. Where Season 1 was a brand new playground and Season 2 was more of a thematic bridge of scale, Season 3 offers a need for scope and depth that I think it will accomplish, but it can't waste a lot of time doing so. The layers that exist within Mandalore and its people are really important to hit on. With an entire civil war and various uprisings plaguing its history, there's more than enough lore to flesh out both Din Djarin and this Mandalorian world that would go a long way to recapturing some of the magic that was first felt in Season 1, as well as reintroducing personal stakes that matter since Grogu's decision has essentially been ignored. The intrigue with Mando now in this sandbox is really reliant on Mandalorian culture and ethics within the narrow scope of his character arc, which is what I hope this season decides to explore. There are always serviceable Mandalorian tropes that still hold up, from great space chases and nice cinematography to really highlighting the production quality that's been put front and center for the season. All of these things make for a nice viewing experience, but they won't mean much if the meat and bones of the story underneath are undercooked or not seasoned well. I have a lot of faith in this season to right some of the stumbles in Season 2 and lose a lot of the unnecessary filler and fat that tends to plague serialized westerns, which The Mandalorian takes clear inspiration from. If nothing else, Andor proved you can touch on darker tones without introducing that gratuitous violence, and I hope The Mandalorian can maybe echo some of those more mature themes and welcome the exploration of man versus world that it clearly seems to be going towards. There's a great supporting cast and a plethora of extended material to pull from to give this season a bigger scope in both its world building and its deconstruction of Din Djarin, but only time will tell if there's enough in the tank to get us there. All in all, I think no matter what happens, we won't be seeing the last of Mando. But I do think it's time to maybe question the trajectory of this character and how he can be improved with the right story and ideas behind him. It is time for Mando to evolve. He has an interesting story to unravel, and I'd hate to see it end with his character in the same spots he was in after Season 1 and Season 2. Albeit, the rescue did make Mandalorian interesting again, but that was before Boba Fett ruined everything. And as always, thanks for watching.